Supreme Court Justice Alito has slammed his fellow justices who approved their dead-of-night emergency ruling that temporarily blocked the Trump administration from continuing the deportations of illegals out of the country under the AEA, or Alien Enemies Act. Essentially, what the Supreme Court did here is they went rogue from normal protocol to issue this unsigned one-paragraph order at 1 a.m, meaning we don't even know which justice issued this, so none of them have to take the blame. And the court directed the Trump administration not to deport any members of the detainee class from the United States until further order of the court, which all of this is highly unusual and strange. Now, the New York Times, they write, Alito releases dissent in Supreme Court decision blocking deportations. Justice Samuel Alito wrote that the court's overnight order blocking the Trump administration from deporting a group of Venezuelans under a wartime law was not necessary or appropriate. This is written by Abby Van Sickle. Justice Samuel Alito, she writes, dissented in the Supreme Court's decision on Saturday to block the Trump administration from deporting a group of Venezuelan migrants, illegal aliens, and gangsters accused of being gang members under a rarely invoked 18th century wartime law. I love how they keep trying to put that out there. There must be some sort of get-together group decided we just need to keep calling it an 18th century wartime law. Anyway, calling the court's order hastily and prematurely granted. In his 5-page dissent released on Saturday, shortly before midnight, Justice Alito, joined by Justice Clarence Thomas, wrote that in his view, the court's decision to intervene overnight was not necessary and or appropriate. The court's unsigned one-paragraph order came after a fast-moving legal battle late Friday. The American Civil Liberties Union, or ACLU, had rushed to several lower courts, then to the Supreme Court, claiming that the Trump administration was planning to deport more Venezuelan migrants, presumably to El Salvador, with little to no due process under the wartime law, the Alien Enemies Act. The Supreme Court's decision ordered a pause on the deportations of the detainees while it considered the emergency application. The order suggested by the Supreme Court a deep skepticism on the court about whether the Trump administration could be trusted to live up to the key part of an earlier ruling that said detainees were entitled to be notified if the government intended to deport them under the law within a reasonable time and in a way that would allow the deportees to challenge the move. Now, here's the thing. The Supreme Court doesn't have a right to be to have skepticism about whether or not Trump will do something. They should only be ruling on what has happened. Now, Alito wrote at the end of his dissent, in sum, literally in the middle of the night, the Supreme Court, issued unprecedented and legally questionable relief without giving the lower courts a chance to rule, without hearing from the opposing party, within 8 hours of receiving the application, with dubious factual support for its order, and without providing any explanation for its order. Justice Alito said that he had refused to join the court's order because we had no good reason to think that, under the circumstances, issuing an order at midnight was necessary or appropriate. So, essentially, Alito is arguing that the Supreme Court should not have acted without hearing from the government. Obviously. These Supreme Court justices, in their haste to issue their ruling, didn't even allow for the Justice Department to respond, meaning it was just the ACLU with their BS, their bullshit arguments. And the Supreme Court just said, okay, rubber stamp. This is highly unusual, highly irregular, and it's out of order for this supposed noble court. What are they doing here? Supreme Court Justice Alito is absolutely right on the money, by the way, calling it a breach of standard procedure. This was an outrageous ruling by a Supreme Court that should know better. Frankly, it should be done away with. They should retract their ruling. And maybe there's still time for them to do that. But in any case, as Alito pointed out, the Fifth Circuit Court was already in the process of hearing the ACLU's appeal. And guess what? They ended up denying the ACLU's request for a stay, calling it premature. There was no evidence of imminent deportation. And Justice Alito is also right here that this is creating a dangerous precedent by the Supreme Court of granting class-wide relief without proper vetting. This is a huge problem to have the final court in the land to be operating in such a rogue manner. The rule of law in the U.S. is already on the edge of a precipice because you have so many rogue judges going out on a limb to defy the law because they've got TDS, they've got Trump derangement syndrome, they're just anti-Trump. So to hell with the law, they're just going to thwart the administration. And to have the Supreme Court going rogue like this is only going to push things closer to the edge. So what happens next here? Well, for the moment, the Supreme Court's order is prohibiting the Trump administration from deporting the affected detainees until further notice. The Justice Department, which was not heard by the Supreme Court before their emergency order, will likely file a response or a motion to vacate the stay, meaning they will ask the Supreme Court to wipe this out. The Trump administration will likely argue that there were no deportations planned that were imminent, rather, and they will also argue that the Supreme Court's intervention was unnecessary. There were already courts looking at the case. And so in doing so, the White House's response, the DOJ's response to the Supreme Court will give them the opportunity to clarify or modify their order. And if they're smart, they might try to save some face here and do just that. In any case, in the meantime, the case is still active in lower courts, particularly in the Fifth Circuit, which denied the ACLU's request for a stay back on April 19th. And yes, while the Supreme Court order effectively overrides their order for now, the Fifth Circuit will continue to review the case, and their ruling could potentially shape where the case ends up in the long run. But in the meantime, this is a black eye for the Supreme Court. By going rogue like this, they're continuing to push the country towards a potential constitutional crisis. So let's hope that cooler heads prevail. But of course, only time will tell, and we're just going to have to wait and see what happens next.